Samantha Power is here. She is a lecturer in U.S. foreign policy and founder of the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. In May, she won the National Magazine Award for her article, Bystanders to Genocide, which appeared in the September issue of the Atlantic Monthly. Her new book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, examines America's response to genocide in the 20th century. She argues that opposing mass killings, wherever they occur, is a matter of national security. I am pleased to have her here at this table for what I hope will be a number of conversations. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. Let me just ask you this. At a time that we're talking about a preemptive strike against Iraq, there has been some genocide by the Iraqis. We know the cast of the man's mind. There is a possibility of him acquiring weapons of mass destruction. Do you philosophically have any problem with a unilateral action in this instance?
I think that the evidence that he is on the verge of developing weapons of mass destruction isn't what it should be to warrant unilateral action. I think that the course of the Bush administration has turned to consultation and attempting to work with our allies and to get inspectors in is the right course. Having said that, this is a man who committed genocide. He is a man who used chemical weapons that literally peel the skin off their victims, that cause people to go into conniptions and for their knees to buckle and for them to roll around on the streets in the most horrific pain that one can imagine. My problem with the justification for the preemptive strike, my problem with the Bush administration forever pointing to that fact, to the genocide and to the chemical weapons use, is that many of the individuals who are currently making today's policy were the ones who were in office back in 1987-88. And at that time, we didn't even issue a squeak about what Saddam was doing. The destruction of the Kurds, killing between 100 and 200,000 people, these horrific chemical weapons attacks, they didn't factor into U.S. foreign policy. Our concerns then were national security concerns and economic concerns, domestic farm interests and so on.
87, 88 was the Reagan administration.
It was the Reagan administration.
And the Reagan administration finally, it was Ronald Reagan that finally, for other reasons, because of, I guess, the German trip, signed the Genocide Convention.
Yeah, well...
Which is one of the world's great ironies.
Yeah, it took 50 years almost to get the Genocide Conventions ratified by the United States. And it came about, and this is true of the cemetery that Ronald Reagan visited. He generated, where the SS soldiers had been buried, he generated a wave of domestic protest and outrage.
Elie Wiesel and others went to the White House and said, Mr. President, it's not your place.
Veterans groups, church groups, Jewish groups, the lot. And having languished in the Senate for 40 years with no presidential leadership, nobody had actually owned the Genocide Convention. There's no gain to owning a Genocide Convention, a piece of international law. Reagan came back from Bitburg, met this protest, and said, gosh, well, maybe a way I can offset it is to get that Genocide Convention through the Senate. And so, having languished again for 40 years, this was something that was meant to embody the post-war promise of never again, and the U.S., kind of on the same grounds we're rejecting the International Criminal Court today, that, maybe somebody would accuse us of genocide someday. The U.S. had resisted ratifying, but here you see with domestic political costs, you can actually generate action.
Your indictment of America is because America's had the resources and the values to go do something in time after time, and it has not done it.
It has not done it. The most shocking thing for me in this 6-year investigation was to realize that it's not just that we don't send our troops to stop genocide. I mean, I think that's very unfortunate. Somebody who believes that the U.S. military would not only be effective, but would actually, many of the officers that one talks to would really appreciate such a mandate. But it's not merely that we don't send our troops. It's that when genocide happens, we tend to kind of shut down. It's almost like an all-systems failure. We don't do the diplomatic things. We don't use the word genocide and actually call it, a spade, call it for what it is. We don't freeze the foreign assets of genocidal dictators. We don't use our technical assets to jam hate radio that's being used to propagate hate and the names and addresses of victims as it was in Rwanda. We don't lift arms embargoes against besieged peoples or impose them against, genocidal regimes. I actually think it might have something to do with the potency of never again, culturally and politically in this country. That is, I sort of feel like what you see and this is upon interviewing, 300 U.S. officials and people who are influencing them, I think that there's a feeling that you can't say there's genocide in Rwanda, and we're going to do radio jamming. You know, that you kind of have to go all the way if you're talking about genocide. Or if that's not the fear...
That has to do with never again, a term that came out of the Holocaust.
Meaning that the word genocide and the commitment that we will not stand idly by. And most presidents in the last 30 years, virtually every president has gone, you know, if not to the Holocaust Museum, which came about in 1993, to some other function and said, you know, I pledge to you here, we will never again stand idly by. And I think the word genocide, which was only invented in 1944, it's one of the stories I tell in the book, amazing, self-conscious...
We'll come back to that story. It's an amazing story. Right.
A self-conscious effort to imbue in a word a moral imperative. A man just set out to say, how can I create a word that if you actually hear it, you'll say, whoop, we don't want that to happen.
But before that, what he was struck by was Churchill.
Yes.
And the terms that Churchill had used. And there was no word to describe it.
Exactly. Well, it was during, this is a man, Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish Jew who grew up with pogroms going on all around him in his childhood. He was actually an atrocity buff. Go figure. Other kids are reading comic books. He's reading about, you know, the destruction of the Herreros and all kinds of historic cases of mass slaughter. And he commits himself as a kid, or as a teenager, to being the guy who's going to ban the destruction of peoples. And at that time, he calls it barbarity. The physical destruction of peoples. And he says, and also vandalism is the destruction of their cultural appendages. And in the 1930s, in 1933, he presents a paper at the League of Nations, and he says, we lawyers and statesmen have to band together. We have to ban this practice. There is a danger that this barbarity will happen again. It could happen here in Europe. It happened to the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. And they said, sit down. You know, it's all about the Jews. You're Jewish. You're just concerned about the Jews. He said, it's actually about the Armenians. It's about the Herreros. It's about the Mongols. It's about... I mean, he wasn't, you know, actually as self-conscious at that time as he probably should have been about what the threat that Hitler posed. But they basically laughed and yawned him out of the conference. 6 years later, Hitler invaded Poland upon allegedly declaring, but after all, who remembers the Armenians? Lemkin was set to flight. He lost 49 members of his family, and as you say, in 1941 he heard a radio broadcast delivered by Winston Churchill in which Churchill says, we are in the presence of a crime without a name. And Lemkin says, credulous to the end, he says, but what do you mean? Barbarity, that's the name for what Hitler's doing to the Jews and what Hitler's doing to, you know, whole countries and peoples. But in that moment, he tells himself, I have got to come up with something that does more, that sends shudders down the spine of those who heard it. And his notebooks are filled with little efforts at you know, word norm construction, basically. And in 1944, he publishes a book with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's made his way as a refugee through Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, and landed in the United States in 1942. And he introduces America and the world to this word genocide, and then goes on to be the one to get the Genocide Convention first drafted at the new United Nations and then ratified. Now, the point about genocide, though, is here he gets this moral imperative injected into the term. There is a kind of sense that, you know, genocide is different. You know, even the realists at Harvard will make an exception in their paradigms for genocide. You know, they'll say, you know, we should only intervene militarily on behalf of our vital national interests, understandably, and then there's genocide. You know, Rwanda makes people feel especially badly. It's genocide. It's 800,000 people. And he knew that. He knew there could be something special embedded in the word, especially after the liberation of the camps and the knowledge of what had gone on. But what I was saying earlier is that, to some extent, knowing that we should stop it makes us reluctant to acknowledge when it's happening, because there is a sense of, my God, it's risky to go to Rwanda. It's risky to go to the former Yugoslavia, and it's not about us, actually. It's really about them. It's purely humanitarian. It doesn't, in the short term, seem to implicate economic or security interests. So what you see is a kind of crude cost-benefit analysis where the potential risks or the costs of getting involved are so much greater than the benefits, and there are no costs to being a bystander. Domestically, you'll never pay a price. This is the logic. And that's the tragedy. So instead of doing the little things, which we might do en route perhaps to a military intervention, but, you know, opening up the toolbox and saying, okay, systematic atrocity, systematic destruction of a people, let's have a cabinet meeting. Let's talk about what should be done. You know, can we freeze their assets? Can we name it? Can we threaten to prosecute them? Instead, what you get is a very low-level response, no cabinet meetings.
Okay, but let's take Rwanda, for example.
Sure.
And we now have a former president who says, I wish I'd done more. We have a Secretary General of the United Nations who's troubled by what happened, right?
Yeah, very.
So what lessons have we learned from them?
We are very good at remembering and regretting. We did that for the Holocaust also for 50 years. We are very bad, I think, at understanding that the system, the sort of aircraft carrier does not turn quickly. No bureaucracy does, and the U.S. governmental bureaucracy is you have got ahead of time to say genocide matters. There's been no leadership on genocide in American history.
Here's what you got to help me get to, all right? Because you know this better than anybody. We're at the table, and I'm the president, and we're saying, look, there's problems in Rwanda.
Or today in Burundi. Today in Burundi.
And you're in Burundi, and you're saying to me, as a genocide expert, you've got to do this. You've got to do it because people on a genocidal level are being exterminated. We can't stand by. What is the person who's opposing this saying? What's his or her argument against you?
It's an excellent question, and they vary. There's a whole series of arguments, but the most common is it's not genocide.
So we quarrel about the facts.
Always quarrel about the facts. And the thing that one has to remember about genocide is it almost always occurs under the cover of war. So like Rwanda is a great example. There actually is a war. There's a regular war between two armed parties, and then there's genocide.
Of ours.
Well, there's that. That's a separate argument. Right. But first there's war. And so we deploy ceasefire people to try to deal with the war. Diplomats in the U.S. government haven't ever been trained on genocide. That's not something the Foreign Service School teaches them. How do you recognize genocide? How do you distinguish genocide from war? So the first thing is, oh, it looks more like war to me. And when they hear the word genocide, usually the argument is, oh, but it doesn't look like the Holocaust. It's not 6 million. It's not systematic. It's not mechanized. And I think there's a genuine confusion about what's going on in the early days of genocide. Then usually the argument is, but what would the kind of intervention that you, genocide interventionist, propose, what would it actually achieve? It's genocide after all. You know, what would radio jamming achieve? How could we get our U.S. forces in country or, you know, armies from neighboring countries in quickly? It's too hard. And besides, these people have been killing one another for centuries. They're determined to keep doing so. And of course, what's undergirding it is your point. They're off. They don't matter. They're not. There's no oil in Rwanda. There's no obvious connection, for instance, today to American national security.
I remember people during Bosnia saying, time after time, they've been doing it for generations. That was always the argument.
Look, the people in government are good, a lot of them are very, very good people. And there's certainly people who would think of themselves as those who, when faced with genocide, would behave in a certain way, actively. So something happens, and what you see is you see a failure of imagination. It's very hard to conceive of genocide when it's happening. I mean, we all kind of grew up within black and white.
We knew what was going on in Bosnia, come on.
We knew what was going on in Bosnia. No, but I'm just saying, Bosnia's a classic...
You, of course, knew it.
Bosnia's a classic example, though, where you could easily say, well, it's war, what you can do. Or you can say it's a systematic concentration camps, you know, murder of civilians. It's like that which we said we would never again
Why can't it be both?
Allow. It is both.
Exactly.
It is often both. But look, if you...
So how would somebody then say, well, it's war but not genocide? Because there's no systematic...
Because our paradigmatic genocide...
What's the difference in war and genocide?
It's, again, constructed, but war, the way that I conceive of it, is two armed parties going at it.
Right.
Genocide tends to be one very, very well-armed and determined party setting out to systematically destroy a mainly civilian, you know, ethnic, national, religious group. But what's undergirding it, again...
To achieve their own political and geostrategic goals.
Yeah, but we have in our mind... We have in our mind the Holocaust as what we said we would never again allow.
Right.
For the Holocaust, the Jews weren't armed. In our memory of what that is, it was systematic. It was so clear cut. You know, we don't. When you get news flashes and cables from the field, it doesn't say this is going to end up as 1 million people dead or 800,000 people dead in Rwanda. It says there was another massacre today. Machetes were wielded at Hutu killing Tutsi. We think. You know, I mean, people are really groping in the early stages to decipher the facts. There's very little expertise at a high level of the U.S. government on and related to countries where genocide happens. Cambodia, Kurdistan, Rwanda, Burundi. These are not countries where people on the fast track in the State Department are you know, establishing expertise, and it shows. So what you don't get at the highest levels of the U.S. government, with exceptions, but are senior officials who are owning the problem. And thus what you get is a kind of bureaucratic response, very low level, very red tape laden, and ultimately very ineffective and fundamentally unconcerned with the genocide.
Good question then. I mean, who owns the problem in the previous administration? Who owns it in the present administration, in the State Department? Do you know who to go to? Who owns the problem? Whose responsibility is to be smart about genocide?
There is a war crimes ambassador at large for war crimes in the State Department today. But, and this gets back to your earlier question as to how could it be other? I mean, how could we actually have a country that was more responsive to genocide? You've got to have something more than a ritual trip to the Holocaust Museum. You have got to have a president who has actually made it clear, not just to your ambassador at large for war crimes. He's already on board. He's working with war crimes every day. He's doing his thing. But to the entire bureaucracy, that you view it as an affront to American morality and as a long-term threat to American national security interests if genocide happens. And then, and only then, would the bureaucracy sort of be responsive. The other way that you could get a response, of course, is for domestic political action to happen and for a mobilization to happen. And that's what you see in Bosnia eventually.
Did you really?
Yeah, not grassroots, not sort of people necessarily taking to the streets, although some Jewish groups and church groups eventually did mobilize, but kind of grass tops. Remember the New York Times editorial boards, the Washington Post editorial board?
I think that was more of that. I think more than grassroots. I mean, I think it was...
No, grass tops
an intellectual... I don't mean intellectual in the bad sense, but I mean, there was a kind of... people of influence began to say, what does America stand for if it doesn't stand for this?
Exactly.
And that began to have people talking about values, which struck at the heart. And then, so all of a sudden at tables like this, it was debated.
Absolutely.
And it went out and out and out.
But and crucially, it was debated in the Congress.
Raising those questions. And more importantly, it was debated in the Congress.
And I think that's what you see again and again.
Because they watched and read the New York Times and watched shows that did it.
The executive branch has been very tame, again, focused on traditional national security and economic interests. In the isolated cases that you get action on genocide, you'll get William Proxmire. In the Senate, the wacky senator from Wisconsin, giving 3,211 speeches on the need to ratify the Genocide Convention. 19 years, every day he stood up. You get Bob Dole, who happened to have an interest in the Balkans because he'd been operated on by an Armenian-American doctor and had gone to the former Yugoslavia and watched with his own eyes and seen a group of Kosovo Albanians get beat up by Serbs and had this in his mind. This was back in the late 80s. Had it in his mind. And so when he read the New York Times, he read it in a very different way than President George Bush read the New York Times.
It's amazing to me, back to the Holocaust. There were people who came from... Who was the person who went and documented the Holocaust and came over and explained some of it to...
Karski. Jan Karski, yeah.
Heroic person.
Snuck his way into to a concentration camp and to the Warsaw
Red
Ghetto.
Star on the whole thing, with a star.
Yeah, and came back and had that and very emblematic, historic conversation with Felix Frankfurter, a Jewish... He
didn't believe him in total.
But said the most interesting thing. When Karski presented his facts, said they're systematically exterminating the Jews, Frankfurter didn't say... He said, I don't believe you, as you said, but he says, I'm not saying that you're lying. I'm saying I don't believe you. And you see this again and again. There is a do not compute problem with genocide. It could not. And what we thought...
Somehow you've gotten the wrong idea.
What we thought was that all of the memory, the commemoration of the Holocaust, and the education, and the erection of memorials, and the awareness that we have, we thought that was going to make our imaginations tweak early in the face of future genocides. When in fact, I think one of the things you see is that the bar for what is intolerable is so high that we tell ourselves, well, it's not actually quite like the Holocaust. It's less than the Holocaust. Until, in the case of Rwanda, you actually get to the end of it and you look back and you say, gosh, that was a faster turn pace than the Holocaust.
And this is another argument they make sitting at the table.
Definitely.
It's happening in a lot of places. You want us to go everywhere there's bad and try to take care of it. It's not our role. We are not the policemen for the world.
Absolutely not. We probably are the police chief for the world, however, for the time being. I think that it's crucial for, especially in a world after 9/11 and when we do have other things that we're busy doing, to see that genocide is not just a soft, squishy humanitarian interest. And there are just two cases in the book that I think are quite relevant to the contemporary debate on terrorism. One we've talked about, which is the Iraqi case. The very chemical weapons that he used against the Kurds, Saddam used against the Kurds in 87, 88, are the ones that we are genuinely concerned he's going to use either against Israel or against U.S. forces if we go in, or eventually against U.S. citizens, either at embassies or in this country. At the time, we said, okay, it's chemical weapons use. There's a cable obtained through Freedom of Information Act, a document that says from the Assistant Secretary, human rights and chemical weapons use aside, comma, our interests run roughly parallel to those of Iraq. Human rights and chemical weapons use aside. That was the attitude, and that has been the attitude. An Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs at the time of the gassing of the Kurds. This is the way that we've conceived of genocide. It's this thing that goes on internally. Again, you can see the sort of way it can come back to haunt you. If we had stopped Saddam then, as we should have, when he was committing genocide against his own people, we would likely not be dealing with some of the problems we're dealing with now. The same is true, I have to say, of bin Laden and the Bosnia story. We didn't realize this at the time, of course, because those of us who were there were focused on what was being done to the Bosnian Muslims mainly and the need for outside intervention. But guess who got into Bosnia during that time where the world looked away? Bin Laden got in. He traveled on a Bosnian passport. He set up training bases. These cases of genocide that happen around the world, there's not always a link to U.S. security. But
what was he doing in Bosnia?
He was using it as a training base. Where genocide is going on and you have these failed states, they're magnets for people like him.
Muslims were being victimized in.
Yeah, and he had, ready converts to his cause. But I make the argument because I think, no, we can't go everywhere. But what is notable, and I keep coming back to this toolkit, is how we have not factored in the occurrence of genocide into our interactions with countries where it's happening. And so what I'm saying is, let's not make the best the enemy of the good, and let's not say, just because we're not going to send 500,000 Marines, we're not going to do anything. Right. Let's say, look, the United States has a foreign policy with every country on the earth every day of the year, whatever the level. I mean, for the most part, it's low level in the kinds of countries where genocide happens. But are we going to say chemical weapons use aside, or genocide aside, comma, our interests run parallel? No. We're going to do everything we can. We're going to have an international conversation about which troops should be deployed if military intervention is required. Yeah. But it requires U.S. leadership. To say that the UN should handle it is, it's like saying that know.
And then you have people who come along and say morality has no place in foreign policy.
Yes, people are saying that, although less in this administration.
Less. Well, less period, I think. I think that
so.
Argument. How we define national interest, I think, an argument was made in the Clinton administration and continues, that AIDS in Africa is a national interest of the United States.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with that. I don't think the policy reflects that, however.
No, of course not. But the point is that the argument has been made. I agree with that. That's a normal thing. The interesting thing to me about what you point out is that I keep asking why. Why not? Why not? Why not? Some people ask why, and I ask why not. It is the notion that there's no political price to pay for not standing against genocide. Nobody's going to say, you weren't there early on recognizing genocide, therefore I will never reelect you for anything. Right?
Never. Well, this is, first of all, let me say, the response that I get a lot in this country to the book is, I'm surprised at your surprise. People say to me, because I have very much your reaction when I began going through the material and seeing the documents. I'm thinking, God, you would think there'd be more people, more vocal in more meetings, at least, and that we'd be doing at least these little things. So it's just interesting. We have sort of the same reaction. A lot of people out there say, what do you expect? That's But the second thing to your question, I was very surprised that this book didn't exist, and I think in a way
that's amazing to me too.
It's a testament to this lack of accountability. I mean, those who do nothing don't, there usually aren't books or movies made about people who do nothing. It's when you do something and it goes wrong. So again, that's part of that cost-benefit calculus. As well, gosh, if I get involved in Rwanda and it becomes a Somalia, people are definitely going to write books about Black Hawk going down. But accountability, there's no congressional accountability, no investigation, nothing after the fact.
What do you hope this book accomplishes? Larry Summer, in one of his speeches, said it's going to have a tremendous impact on the challenge to the future. What do you hope it accomplishes?
I think, I mean, what I obviously would love to see is a president who came into office genuinely committed, not just to visiting the Holocaust Museum, but sitting around with his cabinet, or her cabinet, hopefully, and saying, not on my watch. It's not happening on my watch.
Stop right there.
Why?
We now have about 7 or 8 people wanting to be president.
Yes.
Have you ever heard any of them say anything close to that?
No, it's not going to be a stump speech. I don't think it's going to get them
Well,
the votes
Care,
that they're
just
looking
say
for
it.
at the moment. No, I mean, absolutely. And you know.
Has anybody called you up and said, I read your book, I mean, I'm a smart political candidate. I want to be president of the United States. I read your book. I know about your book. And I'm going to make it part of what I believe in to say that this is what this country ought to stand for.
No, but you have done me, you've given me an enormous nudge in that direction probably tonight. But that's one, I think it requires top-down leadership.
Right.
I think the speed with which genocide usually happens means that the commitments have to be made up front. The bureaucracy has to know that it matters and that there will be a price for the bureaucrat to pay to let this happen. But the second thing, and this gets back to your point about accountability, now that this book does exist and that this investigation was done of the select number of genocides, the hope is that there'd be a kind of footstep effect where at a minimum a U.S. official or a journalist, frankly, or an NGO worker would be afraid of ending up in a book like that someday. Yeah. So that there is a sense, at least reputationally, that there's a price to be paid for doing nothing about genocide.
This book is called A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. Samantha Power is now at the Kennedy School of Government, as I said. You ought to read this. I'm pleased to have her on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.